So let's talk a little bit about attachment, loss, and grief. So, in light of the understanding that we've been discussing, that there is only the absolute truth, the one reality, consciousness appearing as the entirety of creation. So, every object is just consciousness taking the form of that object, the one reality taking the form of that object. And all these objects are subject to time, they are subject to birth and death. They're born and they die. They live for a finite amount of time in the eternal and infinite reality of consciousness in which they appear and of which they are made and by which they are known. So, this reality is the sole reality as we have discussed, and it is taking the form of every form that is ever perceived, and every form arises in it, lives out its life in it or consciousness, and is reabsorbed into it at the end of its lifespan. But it or consciousness is present before, during, and after the lifespan of every form, and it appears as every form. Therefore, whatever it is you love or are attached to is actually consciousness appearing as that object that you love or are attached to. So, what you actually love is consciousness, awareness, which allows any object to be or to be perceived. So, in light of this understanding, grief is usually diluted because you realize that that which you are loving and that which you have lost is consciousness appearing as that which you are loving, and therefore the essence or the source of whatever it is that you love, which is consciousness, is perfect, infinite, eternal, and indestructible, and therefore there is no such thing as death actually, because consciousness alone has ever been, consciousness alone is right now, and consciousness alone will ever be, and it is appearing as you and all the things that you love. So the indestructible nature of consciousness implies that it can never be lost. Only the forms that it appears as are lost. And even that is not strictly true, because every form that arises in consciousness consists basically of information. The source of this information is consciousness. So the entirety of the information required for the manifestation of any object is already present in its entirety in consciousness. And therefore there is no death, because as we discussed, consciousness is eternal and infinite and indestructible. Even more profoundly, there is no such thing as birth, because anything that is apparently born is just consciousness taking the form of that object. There is no object separate from consciousness, and no object can exist or be perceived without consciousness. So, the misperception that you are something other than consciousness, something separate from consciousness, that you own or possess things, or that things belong to you in some way, causes the phenomenon of attachment. But when you realize that all objects are consciousness appearing as those objects, including you and the body and the mind, basically, and the emotions that you feel, you realize that nothing real is ever lost, and therefore grief is at the very least diluted and eventually terminated. So there is still a certain degree of attachment to the paradigm of separation in most human beings. Over 99.9% of human beings, in my estimate, there is the attachment to the separate identity, the temporary, apparently separate identity. This is what causes grief, because then there is an immense sense of loss and void when something that you are attached to is taken away, as it will invariably and inevitably be taken away. So the only way around grief and loss is to see the truth as it is, which is that consciousness, or if you want to call it that, God is the sole reality. So you are God, whatever it is you love is God. And when whatever it is you love is apparently lost, it is just God ceasing to take the form of the object that you have apparently lost. And since the information for every form is already present in a state of timeless perfection in consciousness here and now, nothing is truly lost. It's like consciousness is the screen on which the movie of life is playing, and the information for the movie is stored in consciousness. So the screen is the source of the movie, basically. And when a particular form in the movie disappears, uh, the screen still remains, and it is the screen that was appearing as those forms that have apparently disappeared. So, in light of the shift from separation to non separation, grief is terminated. And you realize that there is no such thing as gain or loss, because all possibilities are already present here and now in consciousness. When you are the sole reality and everything is appearing in you from the perspective of being consciousness rather than a separate body mind, there is no longer any fear of loss or desire for gain, because consciousness is perfect and indestructible. Therefore, there is nothing to desire and nothing to lose.